In a previous video, we've seen how to upload a file using an HTML form and send that file to our FastAPI server in order to save the file to the file system. In this video, we're going to go a step further. We're going to add a single page application as our client, and we're going to use React in this video. And we're going to learn how we can send a file from the client-side application to our FastAPI server, and then how we can save that data to the file system again on the server. So in this video, we're going to learn how to programmatically add a file to a FormData object and programmatically send that to the server with a fetch request. So let's get started and dive into the video. What we're going to do to begin with is create a React application. And in order to set up the React project, I'm going to use the create React app, and we have a command here using npx. Now in order to do this, or in order to execute this command, you're going to need Node.js installed on your computer. If you have that, you can go to the terminal, and what I'm going to do is execute a command here, and it's npx create React app and then the name of the application that we want to create. Now I'm just going to create an application called file demo here. That's going to be the name of this React application. Now that might take a little while to install. While it's doing that, let's remind ourselves of the setup we had before. We have a FastAPI endpoint. It's called create upload file that takes a post request, and that has a parameter called file upload, and that is of the type of upload file from FastAPI. And the upload file object is a convenience wrapper around Python's spooled temporary file object. And this object has methods such as read, which is an asynchronous method, and it has an attribute called file name as well, so you can access the name of the file that's been uploaded. Now this endpoint is just going to take an uploaded file and it's going to save it to the file system at the location that we specify there, and that's going to save that onto the file system of the running FastAPI server. So now that our React application is created, it's here in the file demo directory, and the goal of this video is to use React in order to upload a file from the client side and send that file to the FastAPI endpoint, which will then save the file to the file system. So let's get started, and we're going to dive into the source directory of this React application. That contains a file called app.js, and this contains a React component called app, and this is the root component of the React application. We're going to remove the boilerplate here, notably the header tag, just going to get rid of that, and we're left with a div that has the class name of app. And what we're going to do is, within the source directory, I'm going to create a new folder that's called components, and this is going to store any additional components that you define in a React application. You can call this directory anything you like, but I'm going to call it components. And then I'm going to create a new React component in this file here. It's called fileform.js. Now I know in this channel we've focused more on tools like html and alpine.js, and these are much more lightweight tools that integrate better with native HTML. But what we're going to do in this video is obviously dive into React. React is a component-based library, and you can define components by defining standard JavaScript functions such as this one, which we'll call fileform. Now this is going to be a React component, and what a component returns is HTML-like code, which is called JSX, and we can define a return statement, and the returned HTML needs to have a root element. So let's add a root element here, which is just going to be a div. And I'm going to quickly add some more HTML to this React component. Let's define an h1 tag that has the text upload file. And then underneath that, we can define a form element. Now within the form, we need an input, and that's going to have the type of file, and we can close that tag off. Now this input is going to have a button underneath it, so we'll define a button as well, and that's going to have the type of submit. And let's make the text within that button just say upload. So here we have the basic HTML for this React component that's going to have a form, and it's going to have a single field within that form that defines a file that can be uploaded. So this is our initial attempt at a React component. In order to use that in other files, we need to export it. So we can write this statement here where we export default the file form function that we've defined, and then we can import that within the app.js file. So I'm going to remove this logo at the top here, we don't need that, and then just below this import here, I'm going to import the file form, and that's from the /components and then the fileform.js file. So in order to use the file form, we can just refer to it here within our app component, and we can close off that tag like that. So this is a custom React component that we have created, and in order to render the HTML within that, we are referring to it with this syntax in the app component, and then that is going to load the HTML that's defined here in this return statement, or rather the JSX code. It's going to load that into the app wherever we've defined this code here. And this is how React works essentially. It builds up a tree of components, starting at the root component, which is this particular component here called app. So what we're going to do now is run the React development server, and in order to do that I'm going to bring a terminal over to this page here, and we are in the file uploads directory that contains the main.py, the FastAPI file. What we're going to do is go into the file demo directory, which contains our React application, and we can run a command here called npm run start, and that's going to start up the React development server. And we can find the start command within the package.json file of the React project. So if we go to package.json, there's a script block here, and that contains a bunch of commands. One of them is the start command, which will run this command here, and that's how we can start up a development server that we can then use to serve the React project. So once that is completed, what we can do is we can go to localhost 3000. So let's go to the browser now, and you can see we have our page. It contains the h1 tag, then it contains the file field and also the upload button. I'm going to wrap the file field in a div tag so that the upload button appears below that, and I'm going to add some margin bottom to the file field. So let's get back to our React component, which is defined in fileform.js, and let's surround the input with a div. And I'm going to add some styles to this div, and to do that in React, what we can do is we can use two curly braces here, and we can refer to some CSS in camel case. In our case, we're going to refer to margin bottom, and I'm going to set that equal to 20 pixels. And we can close that div tag and move the input of type file into the div, and we can save that and go back to the page, which will auto reload, and now we have the upload button on a new line. And we're using the two curly braces here, and that's because we're referring to a JavaScript object with the inner brace, and that object has the CSS keys that we need, for example margin bottom. Now what we're going to do is when the user selects a file using this input, we want to store that file within the state of the React component. Now in order to do that, we are going to use what's called a hook that you can use in a React component, and that hook is called useState. If we go to the documentation, you can see it's a React hook, and it lets you add a state variable to your component. And this is the way that it's used here. We call the useState hook and provide some initial state, and that useState hook returns two objects. The first one is state itself, and that will be whatever the value of the state is at the given time. The second object is a setter function. You can call that when you need to actually change the value of the state. So let's go back to VS Code. We're going to import useState from the React library. So import useState from React. And then within the component, we're going to define a file and also a setFileSetter function, and that's going to be equal to the useState call. And the initial state that we're going to provide to the hook is just the null state. So what that means is that the file variable will be set to null initially, and then when we actually select a file here with this input element, it's going to update the value using the setter, but we need to actually hook that up, and that's what we're going to do now. So within this input here, we're going to add an event listener, and that's going to listen for the onChange event, and then we're going to call a function that we're going to define in a second, and we'll call that function handle file input change. Now you can see we're using the single curly braces here, and that's referring to a function that we're going to define above the return statement here within the component. So let's define that function now. It's called handle file input change, and that's going to be equal to an arrow function that takes the event as its parameter. And within the body of this function, we're going to call the setFileSetter function to set the state that we have, and we're going to pass to that the event.target.files, and we're going to index in at element 0 here. And as well as that, I'm actually going to console log the event.target so we can see what's on that object in the browser. So let's quickly go over what's happening here. When we select a file using this input element, this callback function is going to be triggered, and what's going to happen within this callback function is we're going to set the file state to the event.target.files. Let's save this and go back to the page, and we're going to see exactly what happens here. I'm going to load up the browser console, and let's select a file here. I'm going to select the JSON sample. Now you can see that being output here, we have the input of type file. That's the console log output, and that comes from line 7 here. We are outputting the target, which is the HTML element that has actually triggered this particular callback function. If we look at the target's files by looking at the .files attribute and refresh this page, if I select a file, for example dog2, you can see that that returns a file list. Now importantly, even though we've selected only one file, this is returning a list. It's called a file list, and it contains each file that has been selected. In our case, just a single file, and that's the dog.png file. And that's why we're indexing in at element 0 here, so we can select the file that has been uploaded rather than getting the entire list of files. So let's remove the console.log statement. And the effect of calling setFile and passing the particular file that's been chosen by the user is that it's going to set this state here called file, and it's going to set that equal to whatever's been chosen by the user. Now I'm going to add a little bit of code at the bottom just below this form element, and I'm going to see what the file is set to at a given time. So let's go below this form element. And the name of the variable in the state is called file, and if that exists, what we're going to do is we're going to output a p tag, and within that p tag we can display the file.name attribute to actually output the name of the file that has been chosen. So let's go back to the browser, and you can see that that is updated already. We've chosen a file called dog2.png, and the name of that file is appearing below the button. And that's because we're referring to the state variable called file, which is being set whenever we select a new file. And if we change the file that's been selected, for example by choosing the JSON sample, you can see that that automatically updates, and that's because the state itself is being updated within the React component, and the state lives here on line 4, it's the file. And whenever this state is updated, the component's code will re-render, and you'll see the updated name of that file appear on the browser. So that's great, but what we actually need to do is programmatically submit this form and have it submitted to our FastAPI endpoint. So what we're going to do within the form element, we're going to add another event listener, and that's to listen for the onSubmit event. And when that event occurs, we're going to call a function called handleSubmit. That's going to be our callback function. So let's copy the name of that. And again, within the component, we're going to define a function called handleSubmit. And that again will take the event itself as a parameter. And let's now define the body of this function. Firstly, we need to prevent the default action, which is to try and send data to a server. So we can call event.preventDefault in order to do that. And what we're now going to do in this handleSubmit is build up a FormData object that we can then send to FastAPI. So what is FormData? I'm going to go back to the FastAPI documentation here. On this page we have a section called What is FormData? I'm going to link this below the video, but FormData is essentially a special encoding for data that is submitted in HTML forms to servers, and it's different from JSON. There's more information in this technical details section below. I'll link this below the video. There's another page I'm going to link called javascript.info, and that contains a section on FormData. But the important thing to know for this video is that network methods such as fetch, they can accept a FormData object as a body, and that body can then send the data to the server, and we can then process that form data, whatever it may be, whether it contains files or just other bits of information. We can process that on the back end, and that's exactly what we're going to do in this video. So what we're going to do now is just go back to our React component here, and I'm going to define a variable here called FormData, and we can instantiate a new FormData object. And this is an API that's available in JavaScript. If we go to the Mozilla documentation, you can see that the FormData interface, it provides a way to construct a set of key value pairs representing form fields and their values. And again, that data can be sent with fetch requests or using the XML HTTP request.send method, basically an AJAX request. So we're going to construct this FormData object and pass key value pairs to that. In our case, we only need to pass a single key value pair, and that's for the file that's been uploaded. So let's go back to line 14 here, and to the FormData object that we've created, there's an append method. And the first parameter to that FormData object is the name that we want to send to the server. In our case, we're going to send a name of file upload, and that matches the name of the parameter that we have within the FastAPI function that is going to handle this request. By calling this file upload and setting its type to an upload file, it's going to be able to find this object, this file, within the body of the request. So we're going to set the name here to file upload, and of course the value that's going to be sent, we want to make that the file itself. And remember, the file is here, it's stored in the React state, and the value of this file state is going to be changed here using the setFileSetter method, and that occurs whenever we change the file input from the browser. So that's how that process works. we're appending that file then to the form data. And what we're now going to do is try and submit this to the server. So we're going to use a try block here, and I'm going to define the API endpoint. Let's call it endpoint and set it to localhost 8000/upload file. And that again matches what we have on the FastAPI server there. We then need to send a fetch request to that endpoint, and we can look at the response as well here. So we're going to set a variable called response, and we're going to await a fetch request to that endpoint. Now, in order to await a fetch request, we need to make this method async, and we can do that using the async keyword here, and that will allow us to use this syntax here and await the response. Now, we want to send a post request, so what we need to do to the fetch request is set some options here. We can do that with a JavaScript object, and one of the keys that takes is a method, and we can set that equal to post in order to send a post request with this fetch. And the second thing we're going to set is the body of the post request. In other words, what data are we actually sending to the server, and we're going to set that equal to the form data object that we've constructed up here on line 13 and 14. Once we get the response, we can check if the response status code was okay, and in that case we know everything has been fine, so we can console.log something to the browser, so file uploaded successfully. And if we didn't get an OK response, we can define an else block here, and I'm going to console.error failed to upload file. So that's the try block. We can also catch any errors that occur when we try to upload this file, and in the case of any errors, we can just console.log them to the browser, and we can see what's went wrong in that process. So this is our handle submit function here. When we submit the form containing the file, it's going to construct a form data object and add a key called file upload and set that equal to the file that's been selected. We're then going to send a fetch request to our FastAPI server, and that fetch request is a post request that contains as its body the form data object that contains the file that's been uploaded by the user. So let's now see if this works. Before we do that, I'm going to minimize all of these, and we're going to look at the uploads directory. This is the server directory that contains the uploaded files, and FastAPI, the endpoint that we've written here, is going to write out the content of any file that's been uploaded to this directory. Now we can see at the moment the uploads directory has nothing in it, so we're going to test out whether we can upload a file from a React application now. So let's go back to the browser, and we're going to go back to the application page. Let's choose a file to upload here, and I'm going to choose the JSON sample file, and we can hit upload, and you can see we're getting a connection refused error, and that's because I've not actually started the 𝗰𝗽𝗀 server that's going to serve the FastAPI application. So let's go back to VS Code, and I'm going to run the 𝗰𝗽𝗀 command, and that's going to start the server, and hopefully now this is going to be able to accept that particular upload of the file. So let's go back to the page, refresh the page, and we're going to select the dog and see if that will work. As you can see on the console, we've got the message that the file was uploaded successfully. So let's go to the terminal here, or rather on the left hand side, the uploads directory, and you can see that the dog.png has been uploaded and it has appeared in this directory. And remember, this directory is on the server. FastAPI has received the file from a React application, and it's then stored that on the server at that particular location that we specified in line 5 here of main.py. So all of the code that we wrote in the previous video is still working on the FastAPI side, because we've constructed a form data object on the React side, and we're adding the file to that form data, and then using that form data as the body of the post request that's going to our FastAPI endpoint. So let's now change this example, and we can see how it works with multiple files rather than just a single file. So what we're going to do is go up to the top of the React component, and I'm going to change the state that we've got here on line 4. Because we're going to be working with multiple files, I'm going to call the name of the state variable files, and the setter is going to be called setFiles. And we're going to initially set that to an empty array in JavaScript. Now below that we have this function here that handles what happens when the file input changes. Now we need to refer to the new name of the setter function, which is setFiles, and within the actual parameter to that we can get rid of the indexing, and we can use the entire file list here, but we do need to convert it from a file list to a native JavaScript array. We can do that with the array.from function. That's a static function on the array object in JavaScript. So let's quickly go over this. The event.target here is the input of type file that you can see in the code on line 39 here. So that has a type of file, and the .files attribute on that refers to an object called a file list that contains a list of all the files that have been selected. So that's a file list, it's not a normal JavaScript array. To convert it from that file list to an array, we use the array.from function. And what we also need to do to the input element itself of type file, we need to add the multiple attribute here, and that will tell the input element that it can accept multiple files rather than just restricting it to one file. And I'm going to remove this statement at the bottom that's listing out the file name. And the last thing that we need to do is go up to this FormData code here, and what we're going to do is loop over the files that are stored in the state of this React component, and for each one of them we're going to append it to a key called file uploads. So let's write some code here. We're going to loop over each file that we have in the state, and for each one of those files we're going to define a callback function. And in the callback function to the form data, we're going to append to that key of file uploads each file that we have in the state. So that's going to pack all of the files that we have in the state into a key called file uploads. We need to go to our FastAPI endpoint, and we're going to change the name of this to file uploads, and then we can bring back the for loop that we had in the previous video where we say for file upload in file uploads, and we can then tab over this content here to read the file and then write its content to the file system. And finally we can return the name of each file to the client here by using a list comprehension and saying f.filename for f in file uploads. So let's now test this out and see if it works. We're going to go back to a React application here, and we're going to choose 3 of these files. Before I hit upload, I'm going to go back to the server and remove any files from this directory so that we can see if each of these are uploaded. And finally we can go back and click upload here, and you can see we are getting an error here. And let's go back to the server code, and you can see the problem within the terminal below here. The upload file object is not iterable. Now what I've done wrong here is we have a single upload file type here. We need to actually tell FastAPI that this is a list of upload files instead, so we can use the list type here in order to do that. Let's go back to the page and we can try submitting these 3 files again. When we hit upload, we get the message that the file has been uploaded successfully. If we go back to our server here, within the uploads directory you see all 3 files. So this is now working perfectly. We have our FastAPI function that is looping over each file that's been uploaded and saving that to the file system. What we're going to do just to finish the video is go over what's going on within the React component. So starting from the top, we're setting some state within that component, and the state variable is called files, and we have a setter function called setFiles that we can then use to change that state. And we're calling that setter function to change the state within this handle file input change function. And that function is what's called whenever the user selects a particular file or set of files from this input element. And then when the form itself is submitted, we have a handle submit function. That's a callback function that's called, and this is the function that constructs a form data object and sends a post request to our FastAPI server with that form data as the body. And that's basically all we need to do to get something up and running with React and FastAPI. The process is very similar for other frameworks like Vue.js or Svelte. If you're interested in those types of videos, just let me know in the comments. But that's all for this video. Thank you for watching. If you've enjoyed the video, please like and subscribe to the channel, and we'll see you in the next video.